You know, political scandals are hardly a new thing, right? But in Japan, they've recently kicked off this huge, intense debate around a really fundamental question. Should the country create its first ever political party law to regulate the very parties that run the nation?
So, why the big push now? Well, this isn't some abstract legal debate happening in a classroom. Nope. It's a direct reaction to some recent crises that have really shaken the public's trust in their political system.
Things like, some really messy leadership fights within the parties, plus these ongoing scandals about political funding, it's all kind of brought this long simmering debate to a boil. People are starting to ask some hard questions, like, are the rules we have now even strong enough to keep things transparent and hold anyone accountable? Okay, so before we really dive into the pros and cons, let's just be super clear on what we're even talking about. What is this political party law they're proposing?
Think of it like this. It's basically one single comprehensive rulebook for political parties. Because right now, Japan doesn't have one. Not really. Instead, they're working with this patchwork of different regulations, like the Political Funds Control Act, that only deal with specific little pieces of the puzzle. This new law would bring the whole shebang under one roof.
Okay, so the whole argument, everything we're about to talk about, really boils down to this one central conflict. Where do you draw the line between the public's right to transparency and a political party's right to freedom? And this clash leads to two totally different ways of looking at what a political party even is. On one side, you have people who say, look, these parties get public money, they hold public power, so they're basically public institutions. That means they have to be held to a really high, legally defined standard. But then, on the other side, you've got folks who argue, hang on, a party is a private group of citizens who think alike. They believe that if you start wrapping them up in government red tape, you could actually damage the very heart of democracy. So the folks who are pushing for this law, their argument goes something like this. Public trust in politics is in the gutter. The only way to fix these recurring politics and money scandals is to have clear, legally binding rules that force parties to open their books and get checked by outside auditors. But then, the other side comes back with a pretty serious warning. They're worried that a really strict, one-size-fits-all law could create so many bureaucratic headaches that it actually smothers new political ideas. They think it would make it almost impossible for smaller, upstart parties to challenge the big guys, and you'd end up hurting political diversity. And that point right there, the one about smaller parties, that is absolutely crucial. In fact, it's probably one of the most heated parts of this whole debate. Yeah, this is the million-dollar question, isn't it? If you create a law to hold the big, powerful parties accountable, could you accidentally end up crushing the little guys, the very parties that are so important for a healthy, vibrant democracy? The opponents, well, they paint a pretty bleak picture. They're saying you'd get this mountain of new, complex paperwork. The cost of mandatory professional audits? That could be totally crippling for a small party that's just scraping by. And what about just registering as a party? If the rules get too strict, that could become a huge barrier, basically keeping new voices out of the conversation altogether. But the proponents say, hold on, these are solvable problems. They argue that the law doesn't have to be this giant blunt instrument. You can design it smartly. Maybe you have flexible rules that change based on how big the party is. You could offer public money, subsidies, to help the smaller groups cover costs. And you can make the registration process simple and clear, not some impossible hurdle. Okay, so that brings us to another really big question. Do we really need a brand new massive law for all of this? Or could Japan just, fix the system it already has? And on this point, the two sides are just miles apart. The opponents are basically saying, hey, the tools are already there. Just get tougher on enforcing the existing Political Funds Control Act. But the proponents fire back saying that completely misses the point. They argue the current laws are only about tracking money. They do absolutely nothing to make sure that the parties themselves are run democratically. And that, they say, is the real problem we need to solve. And for the people who support this law, this is really the heart of it. Yeah, cleaning up the money is important, for sure. But real, true accountability, that comes from making sure the internal governance of a party is transparent. It's about making sure the very groups that write the nation's laws are, themselves, democratic and well-run. So when you strip it all down, this whole debate is really about a fundamental choice. It's about what kind of democracy Japan wants for its future. You can think of it like a balancing act. If you lean too far one way with super high regulation, you get more transparency, sure, but you might be squashing political freedom.
But if you lean too far the other way, you protect that freedom, but you risk seeing the same kinds of scandals pop up over and over again. The real challenge for Japan is, where do you find that sweet spot? What's the right balance for a healthy democracy?
So, in the end, it really comes down to a choice between two very different paths to get accountability. Do you try to guarantee it with a big set of government rules, or do you trust the voters to enforce it themselves at the ballot box, inside a freer system? So which path do you think is right? Is it time for a brand new legal rulebook to try and rebuild public trust? Or should that accountability be left in the hands of voters on election day? It's a really complex question. There are no easy answers, and it really gets to the very heart of how a democracy is supposed to work.